Now that we have the card in place to hold our input form, we can start to think about moving ahead with adding the first of our input fields, the email input. We'll start here by creating a new composable email input in the corresponding file. This will take a modifier argument with a default value. For the email input, we're going to explore the use of the text field composable, which we can add directly to our composable function. You'll notice now that the IDE will be giving you a warning because there's required arguments of the text field. There are the value, which represents the current value to be displayed in the text field, along with the value change handler, which is triggered when the input changes and used to update the composable state. We'll need to satisfy these before we continue, but we'll set these to an empty string and an empty block for now. We'll pass the modifier that's provided to our composable function into our text field, and we're also going to need to add some more arguments to satisfy the requirements of the other properties. For this, we'll add an email argument, which is going to be nullable because when our state is initialized, this is in a null state. And in the cases that this is null, we're going to pass an empty string instead. For the onValueChanged callback, we're going to create a new argument which is called onEmailChanged. This is going to be called with a string value representing the current value of the email input field. We'll then pass this for the onValueChanged argument so this can be triggered and handled by the parent. At this point, we have a very simple email address field. It's enough to allow the user input, but it doesn't look exactly how you want it to look. Currently, it isn't too clear what this input field should be used for, so we're going to add some clarity via the use of the label argument. We're going to want this to simply read email address, so we'll need to add a new string resource to our project. We could then go ahead and compose a text composable inside of the label using the string resource that we just defined. So that we can see what this looks like, we're going to quickly create a new preview using our email input and adding an email address for the email argument. And we can see now what this looks like. We've added the email, we've added the label, and we can see this composed on screen. The label is now pushed to the top with the email address displayed underneath it. If we have a little play of this input field, we might notice the email address exceeds the maximum available width. Things go on to multiple lines, and that looks a little weird. We can fix this by using the single line argument of the composable, allowing us to force all entered text to remain on a single line. The composable will allow horizontal navigation to move through an entered string when this is enabled. With this in place, we can now see that text will remain on a single line, then more than it can fit has been entered. Our email input field is looking good at this point, but we're going to add a small piece of visual decoration by utilizing the leading icon argument. This argument allows us to provide a composable that will be displayed at the start of the input field. For this, we're going to use an icon composable to display an email icon. To access this icon, we're going to use icon's default package. Because this is just a visual decoration, we don't need to provide a content description for our icon. The email input field also has a label that already describes the purpose of the field, so we can rely on that for describing the component to the user. With this in place, we can now see an email icon is displayed at the start of the input field. Now that our email input is complete, we can go ahead and compose it within our UI. But before we can go ahead and compose this, we need to ensure that there is access to both an email and onEmailChanged reference that the composable can use. So we're going to go ahead and add two new arguments to our authentication form composable, and we can copy these directly from the email input as they're going to be identical. We can then pass these to our email input composable during composition. We'll then need to hop up to the authentication content composable and provide these new values. We can simply access the email property from our authentication state, and then we just need to implement the onEmailChanged argument. For this, we're just going to have a new block which calls the handle event function, passing the email change event with the email that is provided to the function. When this is triggered, our view model will be called and the email address will be updated in our state. This new email value will then be provided via the state to a composable function and displayed to the user. If we hop on back over to our authentication form and refresh the preview, we can now see this input field is being displayed inside of our card. We can see it looks slightly off though. You might need a good eye to see this, but the actual input field isn't filling all of the available width. So we're going to make a small tweak here. We're going to hop on back over to the composition of our email input and pass a modifier. We're going to use the fill max width modifier. And if we see our preview refresh, we can now see that the email input field is using all the available width that it has to it, filling the span of the card.